Now, there is a new video that could provide a fresh clue. Let's take a look. A Ring doorbell camera about 2 miles from Guthrie's Arizona home captured several cars that were passing through the area that same night, the same night that she disappeared.
The reason Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law is now considered the prime suspect in her abduction comes down to a crucial detail, a piece of leaked FBI footage that was never supposed to be released to the public. In the recording, a federal agent presses play on a traced phone call made at 2:47 in the morning. As the audio fills the room, the son-in-law's own voice can be heard discussing Nancy's kidnapping with specific details that investigators say only the person who planned it would know. At that moment, the camera captures his reaction. The color drains from his face so quickly that the change is clearly visible in real time.
Abductors have probably burned all their clothes. They've got rid of the car, but they can't get rid of video evidence that's in a neighbor's house, and that's a couple of miles away. So that's good. That's good evidence.
From 6 feet away, investigators can already see his hands beginning to tremble. And in less than 4 seconds, every story he had repeated during the previous 90 minutes seems to collapse. Yet that phone call was only the beginning. What detectives discovered next was even more troubling. The text messages were worse. The searches on his laptop raised even deeper suspicions. And when agents finally examined his financial records, the picture became far more disturbing, turning a trusted family member into what investigators now describe as the most damaging suspect in the entire case. The footage from the interrogation begins without warning. The clock reads 5:30 a.m. The son-in-law is escorted into a stark FBI interview room, still wearing the same pajamas he had on when a SWAT team smashed through his front door with a battering ram barely an hour earlier. His hair is disheveled, his eyes swollen from sleep, yet he already seems to be putting on a performance, projecting confusion, blinking beneath the harsh fluorescent lights like someone who cannot possibly understand why federal agents just dragged him out of bed in the middle of the night. What stands out immediately is that he isn't panicking. Instead, he appears to be performing. Across the table sit 2 FBI agents. The lead interrogator is Special Agent Russell Dante, a 23-year veteran from the Bureau's Violent Crimes Division, the kind of investigator brought in when suspects believe they're the smartest person in the room. Beside him is a younger agent who barely says a word during the next 6 hours. But his pen never stops moving, quietly documenting every sentence, every pause, every subtle reaction as it happens. Then comes the critical moment. Agent Dante reads the Miranda warnings, but the son-in-law brushes them aside as if they're nothing more than a minor formality. Without hesitation, he declines a lawyer, carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone convinced he can outplay 2 federal investigators and be out the door before lunchtime. That decision, made in less than 3 seconds, would end up changing everything. His opening statement sounds carefully polished. "I have absolutely no idea why I'm here. This is insane. I would never hurt Nancy. She's my mother-in-law. I love her like my own mother." His hands rest flat on the table, his gaze steady, each sentence delivered with the calm precision of something rehearsed in advance. It's clear he had prepared for the possibility that this moment might come. But there was one thing he didn't prepare for: Russell Dante. When agents ask him to walk through the night Nancy disappeared, he launches into a detailed timeline. The story comes out smoothly, almost too smoothly, with the kind of consistency that suggests it has been practiced more than once. But inside that carefully constructed account, investigators believe the first cracks are already beginning to form. According to his story, that evening seemed completely ordinary. Nancy had come over for dinner at his home with Annie. After the meal, they played a few rounds of card games, Nancy's favorite pastime. He described her as being in high spirits the entire night. Around 9:45 p.m., he said he offered to drive her home because it was already dark outside. In his version of events, he walked her all the way to the front door, waited until he heard the lock click from the inside, and then drove straight back home. To make the story sound convincing, he added small, vivid details. He talked about what Nancy was wearing, what she had eaten for dinner, even how she laughed while telling a story about her late husband during dessert. And that final detail carries more weight than it first appears. Because if his account were true, it would mean the last evening Nancy Guthrie spent as a free woman ended peacefully. Laughing at a dinner table, surrounded by people she trusted, including the very man now sitting across from Agent Dante. For nearly 90 minutes inside that room, the son-in-law remained completely composed. He answered every question smoothly, without hesitation. At one point, he even asked the agents how the investigation was progressing, presenting himself as a worried family member desperate to help rather than someone who might have orchestrated the entire crime. And Agent Dante let him keep talking. He allowed the story to be told again and again, letting the suspect grow more confident with each repetition. But Dante wasn't trying to gather new information anymore. What he was really doing was building a runway, giving the man enough space to fully commit to a single version of events. Because once that story was locked in place, investigators were ready to tear it apart piece by piece. And that carefully rehearsed timeline would soon become the starting point of a very different kind of interrogation. For 90 straight minutes, Agent Dante allowed the son-in-law to speak, letting him repeat the same story until he sounded almost comfortable. But the moment Dante had been waiting for would shatter that confidence in less than 4 seconds. As the suspect leaned back in his chair, calmly delivering his third version of the timeline, he appeared more relaxed than ever, convinced his performance was holding up. Without breaking eye contact, Agent Dante quietly signaled to his partner. The younger agent placed a laptop and audio equipment on the table without offering any explanation. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The warmth disappeared from Dante's voice as he leaned forward and spoke just 7 quiet words. "I want you to listen very carefully." At first, the son-in-law seemed only mildly curious, almost amused. That reaction lasted only until the speakers came to life. The recording that filled the room was a traced phone call made at exactly 2:47 a.m., placed from a burner phone to the son-in-law's personal cell. In the conversation, the caller discusses Nancy's worsening condition, a ransom plan that had already failed, and what should happen next. But the most chilling part wasn't the content, it was the voice. Because the voice on the recording wasn't vague or uncertain. It was clearly his. On the audio, the son-in-law can be heard calmly discussing logistics, referencing specific details about Nancy's captivity, details investigators say only the person directing the operation could possibly know. And as the recording plays, the camera captures a moment that investigators say speaks louder than any confession. The color slowly drains from his face, the realization unfolding in real time under the cold lights of the interrogation room. For more than an hour, his hands had rested calmly on the table. Now they begin to tremble, so violently that even from 6 feet away, the camera captures it. His body jerks back in the chair, the confident posture gone. His eyes flick rapidly between Agent Dante and the second agent, searching for some kind of escape, but finding none. The recording stops, and the room falls into a deep, crushing silence. 3 seconds pass, then 5, then 7. Agent Dante lets the silence sit there, pressing down on the son-in-law like a physical weight. Finally, he breaks it with a single question. "That's your voice, isn't it?" The son-in-law immediately tries to deny it. "That doesn't sound like me." But his voice cracks on the word "me," betraying the strain. In that moment, it's obvious. He knows, they know, and the camera recording everything knows too. But Dante isn't finished yet. He plays the recording again, this time stopping at key moments, isolating statements that suggest coordination with Nancy's kidnapper. Each pause is deliberate, almost surgical. The son-in-law's breathing turns shallow and fast. The calm composure he held for 90 minutes disappears completely. His eyes dart around the room, his throat tightening as he swallows again and again. Now he begins scrambling for another explanation. He insists the call was about something else entirely, business matters, or a personal situation involving his cousin Marcus that investigators are simply misinterpreting. Agent Dante lets that explanation hang in the air just long enough for the son-in-law to think it might work. The younger agent glances at Dante, while Dante's jaw tightens slightly, the only visible reaction from a man who has spent 2 decades sitting across from suspects who believed they could outsmart him. Agent Dante then gives a small nod toward the folder on the table, and this is where the situation becomes far more disturbing. Because what investigators pull out next makes the phone call sound almost like a warm-up. The younger agent places a thick stack of papers in front of them. Inside are printed copies of every text message exchanged between the son-in-law and Marcus, covering a 3-week period leading up to the night Nancy disappeared. Agent Dante begins reading them out loud, slowly and deliberately. With each line, he slides another page across the table so the son-in-law can see his own words staring back at him in black ink. Thursday night works best. Her routine is predictable. Another page follows. Disable the doorbell camera first. I'll tell you where it is. Then another. Back door is the weak point. The front door has too much security. And then one more detail that chills the room. She takes sleeping pills around 10 p.m. Give it an hour after that. The expression on the son-in-law's face tells the rest of the story. A slow, sinking realization begins to take hold. The understanding that every message he sent while planning this crime has now been recovered and is being read back to him inside a federal interrogation room. These aren't vague messages that could be interpreted in different ways. They mention Nancy's exact routines, the layout of her home, the time she would be most vulnerable, even the medication she took each night. Just hours earlier, she had been laughing at dinner, trusting this man to drive her safely home. But in his own messages, she appears not as family, but as a carefully studied target. Desperate to push back, the son-in-law finally offers an explanation. He claims his phone must have been hacked, insisting that someone else sent those messages in an attempt to frame him. Agent Dante barely reacts. Cell tower records already place the phone exactly where the son-in-law was each time those messages were sent, locations that match his confirmed movements throughout the day. His workplace. His home. Restaurants where credit card receipts prove he was present. The timestamps line up perfectly with his routine, in ways that would be almost impossible for any outside hacker to recreate. The son-in-law quickly shifts to another explanation. Maybe Marcus fabricated the texts somehow, spoofed them to make it look like they came from his phone. But that claim falls apart just as quickly. Investigators explain that the messages exist in 4 separate places: on Marcus's phone, on the carrier servers, on the son-in-law's own device, and inside verified cloud backups. All 4 sources match perfectly, confirmed, authentic, and untouched. On the footage, you can see him slowly sinking deeper into his chair with each explanation that collapses. The confident man who walked into that room earlier is gone now. But even this wasn't the worst discovery. Because what investigators found on his laptop made the phone call, the text messages, and every denial so far look like nothing more than a prelude. 3 days before his arrest, the son-in-law tried to erase his digital trail. He ran a commercial data wiping program on his laptop, targeting his internet history and believing it had permanently deleted everything. But FBI digital forensic specialists recovered it all, every search, every query, every trace left behind. Agent Dante begins reading the recovered search history directly from a forensic report. His voice remains calm and clinical as he lists each entry. Across the table, the younger agent, who has been writing non-stop for hours, finally stops. For the first time in 4 hours, his pen goes still as he quietly stares down at the table. The search's investigators recovered painted a disturbing picture. Queries about how to kidnap someone without leaving evidence. Research into anonymous Bitcoin ransom payments. Questions about how long an elderly person could survive without their prescribed medication. Even darker searches followed. Methods for disposing of remains in desert locations and comparisons between sentencing for kidnapping versus murder. But one search stood out more than the rest. 72 hours before Nancy disappeared, the son-in-law searched a chilling question: whether accomplices receive lighter sentences if the victim dies during captivity. In that moment, investigators began to suspect this wasn't just preparation for a kidnapping. It suggested he had already considered the possibility, perhaps even the intention, that Nancy might not survive it. When agents mapped out the timeline, the pattern became even clearer. The searches stretched across 3 weeks, gradually evolving from vague curiosity into detailed operational planning. How to disable doorbell cameras. How to bypass residential alarm systems. How to recruit accomplices in exchange for cash. On the same laptop, forensic specialists also found searches related to Nancy's medications, her daily routine, and even details about the security system at her home. The son-in-law attempted one final explanation. He claimed he had been researching material for a crime novel. But Agent Dante shut that down immediately. There were no manuscript files on the laptop. No notes, no outlines, nothing that suggested any writing project had ever existed on that device. At that point, the son-in-law tried to invoke his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. But by then it was far too late. Nearly 3 hours of recorded statements, filled with contradictions and denials, had already been captured on camera. And investigators were not finished yet. Because the next evidence they revealed wouldn't just show how the kidnapping had been planned. It would begin to explain why he may have been desperate enough to plan it at all. 3 hours into the interrogation, investigators shifted their focus to motive. And what they revealed painted the picture of a man buried so deeply in financial trouble that he may have convinced himself there was only one way out. It began with his bank records. His checking account was already thousands of dollars overdrawn, sitting deep in the red, the kind of deficit that prompts urgent calls from the bank. But that was only the beginning. His credit cards were completely maxed out, with payments months overdue and collection agencies already closing in. Then agents moved to the next problem, his mortgage. He was in default, facing the threat of foreclosure within 60 days. The very house where Nancy had recently sat at the dinner table laughing with family was about to be taken from him. When investigators added everything together, the numbers were staggering. More than $250,000 in debt, against an income that barely covered his basic monthly expenses. He wasn't just struggling financially. He was drowning. And then agents revealed something else. In the 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared, he had withdrawn $30,000 in cash. When asked where the money had gone, his explanations kept shifting. First he claimed it was for business expenses. Then he said home repairs. Eventually, he simply stared back and admitted he couldn't remember. $30,000 had vanished. But even that wasn't the real motive. What investigators uncovered next made the situation suddenly fall into place. Nancy's current will divided her multimillion-dollar estate equally between her 2 daughters. If she died without changing that document, Annie, his wife, would inherit roughly $2 million. As marital property, that money would effectively belong to both of them. In a single moment, every debt could disappear. But there was a problem. Nancy had already scheduled an appointment with her attorney to revise that will, changes that would significantly reduce Annie's share. The meeting was only days away, and investigators confirmed the son-in-law knew about it. He had overheard Nancy discussing the update during a family dinner. The same dinner where she had been laughing while telling stories about her late husband. The same evening where she carried a framed photo of her grandchildren in her purse. The same night she trusted this man to drive her safely home. He wasn't just facing financial ruin. He was watching what might have been a $2 million lifeline slip away, and time was running out. But the financial evidence only explained the reason. What came next began to reveal the method. And by then, nearly 4.5 hours into the interrogation, the footage shows the son-in-law starting to physically fall apart. His posture slumped, his hands shaking uncontrollably, the confident performance from the first hour completely gone. Around 4.5 hours into the interrogation, Agent Dante senses the moment the pressure is finally starting to break him. And instead of pushing harder, Dante suddenly changes tactics. The confrontational tone disappears. In its place comes something calmer, almost sympathetic, and far more dangerous. After hours of confronting the son-in-law with evidence, Dante begins speaking like someone who understands. His voice lowers. "Look, I've been doing this for 23 years. I've seen a lot of people end up in situations like this." He pauses before continuing. "Sometimes things start as one idea and spiral into something you never meant. Maybe you just wanted to scare Nancy. Maybe you thought if Marcus held her for a day or two, she'd reconsider changing the will. Maybe things just got out of hand." Then Dante leans closer across the table. But right now Nancy is somewhere out there. She's 84 years old. She doesn't have her heart medication. She doesn't have her blood pressure pills. She carries a framed photo of her grandchildren in her purse everywhere she goes. And right now she's alone. He lets the words hang in the air before adding quietly, "You can stop that suffering right now, right here in this room." And that's when the wall finally begins to crack. For the first time in more than 4.5 hours, the son-in-law's eyes begin to fill with tears. What comes next is small, but it changes everything. "I knew Marcus was having financial problems," he says quietly. "I gave him some money to help him out." Agent Dante asks one simple question. "How much?" The answer comes hesitantly. "Maybe 20,000. That single statement instantly contradicts everything he had said earlier. For 3 hours he had claimed he didn't remember where the cash withdrawals went. Now he is admitting that $20,000 went directly to Marcus, the very man investigators believe carried out Nancy's kidnapping. In his own words, the financial link between planner and accomplice is suddenly on record. The crack in the wall is now impossible to hide. With total denial no longer believable, the son-in-law quickly shifts to a new strategy. He acknowledges giving Marcus money but insists his cousin acted alone, that Marcus was desperate, unstable, and must have planned the kidnapping himself after overhearing family conversations about Nancy's routine. Agent Dante lets him talk. He listens patiently, nodding, taking notes as if the explanation might actually make sense. For several minutes, he allows the story to grow. Then, just when the son-in-law seems to believe the narrative might hold together, Dante quietly dismantles it with a single sentence. Agent Dante then delivers a line that changes the entire atmosphere in the room. "We have Marcus in the next room," he says calmly, "and he's telling us something very different." For the second time that morning, the color drains from the son-in-law's face. According to Marcus, it was the son-in-law who first approached him with a plan. He laid everything out, the timing, the entry point, and the moment Nancy would be most vulnerable. Marcus told agents he was promised $50,000 to take her and keep her hidden until either a ransom was paid or she died without access to her medication. Marcus also provided details investigators quickly verified. He described the restaurant where they met, the parking lot where the cash was handed over, and instructions about Nancy's home that he couldn't possibly have known on his own. He even knew which sleeping pills she took and the exact time she usually took them. That kind of information doesn't come from casual family conversation, it's operational detail. And here's the reality investigators see again and again: conspirators assume loyalty. But when federal charges appear, loyalty often disappears just as quickly. When Marcus realized he was facing decades in federal prison, that loyalty collapsed. Self-preservation took over. More evidence followed. Security camera footage showed the two men meeting at a restaurant shortly before Nancy disappeared. Witnesses from the restaurant recalled overhearing them discussing what sounded like a job. Financial records revealed additional payments beyond the $30,000 already uncovered. Completely cornered, the son-in-law made one final attempt to shift the narrative. He argued that the conversations about kidnapping were only hypothetical, that he might have mentioned Nancy's routine but never directly told Marcus to take her. Agent Dante responded by pointing back to the 2:47 a.m. phone call. A man who is truly surprised by a crime doesn't receive calls from the kidnapper discussing the victim's condition. He doesn't talk through the logistics of a failed ransom. And he certainly doesn't ask what should be done about an 84-year-old woman who is running out of time. The footage captures the moment the realization settles in. There is no version of this story that ends with him walking out of that room. Every lie has been documented. Every shift in his story recorded. And somewhere down the hallway, Marcus is filling in the details that the physical evidence alone could not explain. It took 6 hours for the man who entered that room believing he could outsmart investigators to unravel under the weight of his own contradictions. But what disturbed agents the most wasn't just the evidence. It wasn't the internet searches, the messages, or even the phone call. During 6 hours of questioning, dozens of opportunities to speak about her, the son-in-law never once expressed genuine concern for Nancy. Every tear was about himself, his future, his life falling apart. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, the woman who had laughed at dinner the night she disappeared. The woman who carried a framed photo of her grandchildren in her purse everywhere she went. Yet in the evidence investigators uncovered, she appeared not as family, but as a number attached to an inheritance. And what Marcus later told agents about the first 48 hours after Nancy was taken left even veteran investigators shaken into silence. The question everyone inside that building kept asking was simple and terrifying: was Nancy Guthrie still alive? When investigators finally found her, the answer changed everything.